Mornings start early in New York. Margaret Clark woke up before her alarm went off and looked out the window. Manhattan's skyscrapers glistened in the morning sun. Every time she saw this view, she was reminded of how far she had come. Monday again, Margaret sighed as she got out of bed. As the marketing director at Lewis and Clark Advertising Agency, she had already become a respected figure in the industry. Her ideas and leadership had guided successful campaigns for many famous brands, and as a result, her bank account had grown steadily. However, her savings seemed to be constantly diminishing. While making coffee, Margaret picked up her smartphone. There was a new message from her mother. "Maggie, Brittany's rent is due soon. And my refrigerator broke down. I need to buy a new one. Could you wire the money by the end of the week? Love you." Margaret stared at the screen and silently took a sip of coffee. It had been 5 years since she started supporting her mother Carol and sister Brittany financially. After her parents' divorce, her father remarried another woman and moved to the West Coast, leaving Carol and Brittany behind. At that time, Margaret had just received her first big promotion at the advertising agency and thought she could help her mother and sister. It was supposed to be temporary assistance. But now, she was paying the full rent for her mother and sister's apartment and most of their living expenses. Margaret herself lived in a Manhattan apartment that was far from cheap, and had to invest in social activities and a wardrobe necessary for her job. The funds for her dream of starting her own marketing consulting company were accumulating only very slowly. As she replied to the email, Margaret thought, "I probably need another 3 years. Until I can build a sufficient client list and secure a stable income." On the train to the office, Margaret checked her schedule. Today she had an important meeting with the CEO and needed to prepare a presentation for a new client. She took another sip of coffee and took a deep breath. No matter how tired she was, she had to be perfect at work. Her salary wasn't supporting just one person, but 3. "Margaret, this presentation won't do. We need more impact," said CEO Jennifer Ross as she put the documents on the desk and looked at Margaret. "Can you rework it by tomorrow?" Of course, Margaret smiled, but inside she was screaming. She had dinner plans with her mother and sister tonight. She couldn't cancel. She had already broken a promise last week because of work and had to listen to her mother's complaints on the phone for an hour. "I'll make it work." Back at her office, Margaret answered a phone call. It was from Brittany. "Hey, Maggie. We're going to that Italian restaurant tonight, right? I've been dying for their tiramisu. Oh, and I found a new bag. It's so cute. Emerald green, perfect for our Hawaii trip." Margaret closed her eyes. Hawaii trip. Yes, she had promised to send her mother and sister to Hawaii as a birthday present. She was too busy with work to go herself, but wanted them to enjoy it. "Great, Brittany. But let's talk about it at dinner. I'm swamped with work." "Got it. But don't be late. Mom's looking forward to it too." That evening, Margaret finally arrived at the restaurant. She was already an hour late. "I'm so sorry, the meeting ran long." Her mother Carol waved her hand dismissively. "It's fine, Maggie. We ordered wine already. For you too." Carol was over 60, but thanks to expensive beauty treatments and meticulous hairstyling, she looked 10 years younger. Brittany had the same blonde hair and blue eyes as Margaret and was always fashion conscious. "So, Maggie, how's that new project going?" Carol asked, tilting her wine glass. Margaret took a deep breath. "To be honest, it's not going well. The CEO didn't like the current plan, and I have to redo it by tomorrow." "That's tough," Carol said, but quickly changed the subject. "Speaking of which, Brittany, tell her about your new boyfriend." Brittany's face lit up. Oh, Jason. He's an investment banker. He bought me a necklace from Tiffany's the other day. Margaret silently drank her wine. She was used to not being taken seriously with her concerns. After all, she wasn't the one being supported, but the supporter. What about you, Maggie? Haven't met anyone nice? Her mother asked. Mom, I'm too busy with work to meet anyone, Margaret smiled. Besides, right now I am. See, I told you, Brittany interrupted. Maggie's all about work. But you should start thinking about it soon. You're not getting any younger. For the remainder of dinner, the conversation mostly revolved around Brittany's love life and rumors from Carol's social circle. As usual, Margaret took care of the bill before leaving. See you next week, Maggie, Carol kissed her daughter on the cheek. And don't forget about the refrigerator. I won't, Mom. Back at her apartment, Margaret worked late into the night revising the presentation. Rubbing her tired eyes, she opened her banking app and transferred $500 to her mother's account for the refrigerator and paid her sister's apartment rent as well. Someday I'll have my own company, Margaret reassured herself. Just a little more patience. But she didn't know how long that a little more would stretch. The same routine awaited her tomorrow. As she laid her tired body on the bed, Margaret continued to postpone her dreams little by little for the sake of her beloved family. Margaret's office was bustling from early morning. The campaign for the leading cosmetics brand, Bella Beauty's, new line was reaching its climax. This project had the potential to be a turning point in her career. Success could lead to a promotion, but failure could mean not just a pay cut but even jeopardizing her position. Everyone, listen up, Margaret raised her voice in the conference room. We only have a few hours until the presentation. Let's hurry with the final checks. The creative team members nodded and returned to their tasks. Margaret headed to the break room and took a deep breath. For the past 3 weeks, she had barely slept. She only went home to change and get a few hours of rest. Still, she never missed the financial support for her mother and sister. You'll be fine, her assistant Jessica placed a hand on her shoulder. This presentation is perfect. Thank you, Margaret was about to smile when her smartphone vibrated. It was a message from Brittany. Emergency. Call me right away. Margaret frowned. Her sister's emergencies were usually things like finding a new outfit or being invited to a party with friends. However, right before the presentation, she didn't want any additional worries. I'll call you later, she replied briefly and switched her smartphone to silent mode. Just before the presentation began, Margaret took a moment to visit the restroom during a short break. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired, but makeup concealed it well enough. Checking her smartphone again, she saw that Brittany had sent multiple messages in succession. Maggie, something terrible has happened. Why aren't you responding? We're family. I need money. $2,000 by tomorrow. Margaret sighed. Typical Brittany. Even at this moment before her presentation, her sister prioritized her own problems. In fact, just last week she had sent $1,000 for another emergency shopping need. Perhaps due to fatigue, emotions that she would normally suppress began to surface. Could you, just once, be considerate of my important day too? Looking at her smartphone notifications, she saw one from Instagram. Brittany had started a live broadcast. Why now? Margaret wondered, but curious about what her sister was doing, she opened the app. On the screen were Brittany and her mother Carol. The two were sitting on the expensive sofa that Margaret had given them last month, drinking wine. Laughter could be heard. So how much did you tell Maggie? Carol asked. $2,000, Brittany answered with a giggle. Actually, $1,000 would be enough, but if I get extra, I can go for my next nail appointment and spa day. Good thinking, Carol responded, tilting her wine glass. She's so oblivious to these things, which works out well for us. Margaret gasped. Her heart began to race. She's truly the ultimate ATM, Brittany continued. Let's go to Hawaii on Big Sister's money again. Last time we got a hotel upgrade, but this time maybe we should ask for first-class flight tickets too. She won't even notice, she's so clueless, Carol laughed loudly. She said she's saving for her own dream. But as long as we're around, that day will never come. Something snapped in Margaret's mind. She was paying a higher rent for her sister than for her own apartment and covering her mother's living expenses too. She had been gradually depleting her savings meant for pursuing her own dream to support her family. Brittany suddenly leaned closer to the screen. Oh no. I forgot to end the live stream. The screen went dark. Margaret stood frozen. It took a few seconds to accept the reality before her. Her beloved family, especially her sister Brittany, saw her as nothing more than an ATM, a source of money. She only noticed the tears streaming down her cheeks when her assistant Jessica knocked on the bathroom door. Margaret, we're about to start. I'm coming, Margaret forced herself to speak. Staring at herself in the bathroom mirror, she took a deep breath. Be professional, she told herself. Focus on work now. Emotions later. Taking out her smartphone, Margaret quietly opened her banking app. She removed the automatic transfer settings to her mother and sister's accounts and blocked their contacts. The action felt surprisingly calm. When Margaret returned to the conference room, her eyes were red, but no one said anything. She spread out her materials and began the presentation. The words came out automatically. In her mind, thoughts about the relationship she had built with her family, her role, and her future were spinning. The presentation was a success. The client was satisfied with the plan and signed the contract on the spot. Team members were excited and invited her to celebrate, but Margaret politely declined. I'm going to leave a bit early today. Thank you all, really. Returning to her apartment, Margaret collapsed onto her bed. Finally, the dam of emotions broke, and she cried out loud. The pain of betrayal, anger, and above all, sadness overwhelmed her. Why, she questioned. Why did you use me like this? As the night deepened, a determination began to grow in Margaret's heart. She would never let herself be used again. The next morning, when Margaret woke up, her head felt as heavy as lead. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her throat was dry. Still, she got up and opened the window. It was the same New York morning scene as always, but something was different. It was herself. Looking at her smartphone, she saw dozens of unread messages from her mother and sister. Margaret read them but didn't reply. Instead, she opened a file she had been nurturing for a long time. It was a business plan for her own marketing company, Margaret Clark Consulting. For 5 years, she had been waiting to pursue this plan. She had put her dreams on hold for her family. Enough, she whispered. It's time to live my own life. Instead of heading to the office, Margaret met with her boss, Jennifer, and submitted her resignation. I've been thinking about this for several weeks, Margaret said quietly. I want to go independent and start my own consulting company. Jennifer looked surprised but quickly showed understanding. I'm honestly sorry to see you go, but you can do it. I'll introduce you to clients. Thank you, Margaret smiled. There was a sense of liberation in that smile that she hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret worked tirelessly to build the foundation for her new life. She found a smaller, more affordable apartment and began preparing to move. Her savings, finally being used for their original purpose, now that she had stopped supporting her family. Contact from her mother and sister continued relentlessly. Phone calls, messages, emails, and even attempts to reach her through mutual acquaintances. However, Margaret didn't respond and instead made an appointment with a psychological counselor. "They were using you," Dr. Reed gently said. "But perhaps you also accepted that role in your relationship with them." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "Your desire to be loved and recognized may have led to your meeting all of their demands. They needed your money, and you needed their affection. It's an unhealthy dependency." Margaret deeply considered these words. Indeed, she had sought gratitude and recognition from her family. But it was never genuine. Only the money she provided had value to them. The day she moved into her new apartment, Margaret gazed at the view from the window. It wasn't as grand as her previous high-rise, but she was content with this small space. This was her own choice. The first office space for Margaret Clark Consulting was a small shared workspace in Brooklyn. Just a desk, a computer, and her passion, that was all she had. "This is the real beginning," she said, staring at the empty whiteboard. The first month was tough. Finding clients was difficult, and income was unstable. Sometimes, she regretted leaving her stable previous job. But Margaret didn't give up. She worked late into the night, attended networking events, and relied on referrals from former colleagues. And finally, she secured her first major client. It was an emerging cosmetics brand called the Bloom Organics. The founder, Sophia, was impressed by Margaret's presentation. "I love your passion and creativity," Sophia said while signing the contract. "I wanted to work with someone like you rather than a large agency." That night, Margaret celebrated this small victory. She opened a bottle of champagne alone and toasted to the future of her company. Her phone rang, and her sister's name appeared on the screen. Margaret hesitated for a moment but didn't want anything to spoil her victory tonight. She ignored the call and stepped onto the balcony for a deep breath. The previous Margaret would have answered the phone immediately and tried to meet any demand. But now she was different. She was beginning to understand that her worth wasn't just about money or what she could give. A true family relationship is based on mutual respect and love, not one-sided exploitation. The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling lighter than she had in a long time. The wounds hadn't fully healed, but strength to move forward was blossoming. She picked up her smartphone and saw new messages from her mother and sister. They had somehow managed to find out the addresses of Margaret's new apartment and company. "Maggie, I'm coming to visit tomorrow. We need to talk." Margaret took a deep breath. She knew she would have to face them eventually. But now, she was in a different position. Not as a weak ATM, but as a strong woman who understood her value and could set boundaries. She opened her laptop and began working on a marketing strategy for her new client. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: from now on, she would live for herself. And that was just beginning. In her small Brooklyn office, Margaret was deeply focused on her work. The Bloom Organics campaign was doing well, and she had already received inquiries from 2 new potential clients. Her business was growing slowly but surely. The phone rang, and Margaret looked at her smartphone. It was from her friend Sarah. Sarah was close to both Margaret and her mother, and was the only mutual acquaintance Margaret had maintained regular contact with since cutting ties with her family. "Maggie, we need to talk," Sarah's voice sounded concerned. "It's about Carol and Brittany." Margaret sat deeper in her chair. "What happened?" "They haven't paid rent for 2 months. The landlord is demanding they move out. Brittany called me in a panic." Margaret closed her eyes. She could almost see her mother and sister in front of her, leaving the apartment whose rent Margaret had been paying until 2 months ago, carrying their belongings. She tried to push away feelings of guilt. They're adults, Sarah. They'll figure it out. I know. But... Sarah continued, carefully choosing her words. Carol said she's working 2 part-time jobs. Brittany also started waitressing at a restaurant, but it's not enough for their apartment rent. Margaret was a bit surprised by this information. She hadn't expected her mother and sister to actually start working. It was an unbelievable change from how they had been before. I sympathize, but it's still not my concern, Margaret answered as calmly as possible. They said they're planning to visit your office this afternoon. Margaret looked at the clock. It was 3 in the afternoon. Thanks, Sarah, for letting me know. After hanging up, Margaret stared out the window. She knew she would have to face her mother and sister someday. But she wasn't prepared. In her heart, anger and sadness mingled. She recalled the faces of the 2 women who had called her an ATM and laughed. A knock sounded at the office door. Margaret took a deep breath and said, "Come in." The door opened, and Carol and Brittany were standing there. Compared to 2 months ago, the two had changed considerably. Carol's hair wasn't perfectly styled as before, and her makeup was subdued. Brittany was wearing simple jeans and a sweater instead of luxury brand clothes. Both looked tired. Maggie, Carol spoke first. "We finally found you." Margaret remained seated at her desk, looking at them. "What do you want?" Her voice was intentionally cold. "Why did you cut off contact?" Brittany stepped forward. "We're really struggling." "I'm sure," Margaret replied calmly. "It must be difficult when your ATM breaks down." At those words, the color drained from Carol and Brittany's faces. They exchanged glances. "What are you talking about?" Carol tried to pretend ignorance. "The Instagram live stream. Where you called me the ultimate ATM and laughed," Margaret said, controlling her emotions. "You said I wouldn't notice because I'm a clueless, remember?" Tears welled up in Brittany's eyes. That was just a joke." "A really funny joke," Margaret said sarcastically. "Especially considering that I paid the full rent for your apartment, subsidized your living expenses, and sacrificed my own dreams." Carol sank into a chair. "Maggie, Mom, please don't make excuses," Margaret interrupted her mother. "I loved you both. That's why I wanted to support you. But you didn't love me. You were just using me." "That's not true." Brittany cried out. "You're my sister. I love you." "Really?" Margaret calmly asked. "Then why didn't you listen to my work stories, share my concerns, and only asked for money? No matter how tired or struggling I was, your demands never stopped." Carol began to cry. "We were wrong. But you're still our daughter and sister. Will you abandon your family?" Something broke inside Margaret at those words. "Family," her voice rose. "Wasn't it the family that abandoned the ATM? I was always there for you. But did you ever think about me, even once?" The room fell silent. It was clear that Margaret's words had struck home. "We're really in trouble now," Brittany finally spoke. "We can't pay the rent and have to move out next week. Won't you help us?" Margaret inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly. "I can't," she answered quietly. "I will never be your ATM again." "But what are we supposed to do?" Carol asked with a desperate expression. "Live by your own strength." "Like I did," Margaret stood up and walked toward the window. "I've just started my own business too. It's not easy, but I have to work hard on my own. Maggie, please, Brittany said tearfully. We really regret what we said. Do you really? Margaret turned around. Or do you just want money again? They couldn't answer. Her words were harsh but true. I don't hate you, Margaret finally said in a softer voice. I'm just hurt. I've lost trust. It will take time to get that back. So we can hope? Carol asked hopefully. I can't promise anything right now, Margaret answered honestly. I need time to think. But one thing I can tell you is that we can never go back to the relationship we had before. I'm not your bank. Brittany nodded, wiping away tears. I understand. But please don't abandon us completely. I need time, Margaret repeated. For now, face your own problems. I'm going to live my own life. After they left the room, Margaret stood by the window, gazing at the outside view. Conflicting emotions swirled inside her, sympathy and anger, affection and disappointment, a sense of liberation and loneliness. Her smartphone rang. It was an email from a new client confirming tomorrow's meeting. Margaret took a deep breath and returned to her desk. Life goes on. And now, she was living for herself. I've grown, she whispered quietly. Maybe they need a chance to grow too. Outside the window, she could see Carol and Brittany walking away, shoulders pressed together. It looked like they were facing problems together for the first time. Margaret had complex feelings, but was confident in her choice. Love sometimes has to be tough. And true love isn't about spoiling someone, but encouraging growth. A year had passed. Marketing industry notables gathered in a small Manhattan event hall. It was the one-year anniversary party for Margaret Clark Consulting. A toast. Sophia raised her voice. To Margaret, celebrating your success. The sound of clinking glasses echoed, and Margaret smiled. This year had passed like a whirlwind. The Bloom Organics campaign was a huge success, doubling the company's sales. Other clients flocked to Margaret after hearing of her reputation, and she hired 3 staff members and moved to a larger office. Last month, she had also received the Emerging Marketing Leader award. Her decision to pursue her dream had been right. After the party, Margaret returned to her new Brooklyn apartment. It wasn't larger than before, but she liked the place. It was an apartment she had chosen herself, paid for with her own strength, and decorated in her own style. On the kitchen table was an envelope. It was a Christmas card from her mother and sister. Margaret took a deep breath and opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Dear Maggie. This year, we have learned many things. When you left our lives, it was a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. I am now working full-time at an insurance company. Brittany has been promoted from the restaurant and is working at a hotel front desk. We share a small apartment, but we're paying the rent with our own efforts. For the first time. We want to apologize to you, not just for the money. We sincerely apologize for hurting you, using you, and not being true family. We are ashamed of our actions. If you're willing, could we see you at Christmas? Just to talk. With love. Mom and Brittany. Margaret finished reading the letter and sat on the sofa. The pain from a year ago hadn't completely healed, but its sharpness had softened. Over the past few months, she had continued receiving counseling and learned that her worth isn't determined by how others treat her, but exists within herself. A few days later, Margaret entered a cafe. She could see her mother and sister sitting at a table. They were different from before. Carol's hair had more white in it, and Brittany wasn't wearing flashy clothes or makeup. Both were looking at Margaret with tense expressions. Hello, Margaret said quietly. Thank you for coming, Carol responded. The conversation was awkward at first, but gradually became more natural. Her mother and sister talked about their new jobs and spoke of the difficulties and joys of living independently. We've changed, Brittany said with a serious expression. Thanks to you, Maggie. I'm not an ATM, Margaret said quietly. I'm a person. A person with feelings who deserves respect. We know, Carol tried to take her daughter's hand but stopped halfway. From now on, we'll listen to you. In the true sense. Margaret nodded. Complete forgiveness would still take time. But the possibility of a new beginning was visible. The three of them were finally beginning to learn the true meaning of family, the balance of giving and receiving, and above all, the importance of valuing oneself. One step at a time, Margaret smiled. Outside, snow had quietly begun to fall. It was the beginning of a new season.